There was a spark, a loud pop, and then the most glorious shriek I'd ever heard from over the fence. Karen, my entitled neighbor, was screaming like her Gucci sneakers had just caught fire. Technically, it was her son's ATV Charger that caught fire, and technically, she had it coming. You don't steal power from an electrical engineer and expect to get away with it, not after I warned her, not after she ignored me, and definitely not after she told me, laughing by the way, it's just a little juice, lighten up. Oh, I lightened up all right. I lightened up her entire backyard with enough voltage to turn her off-brand ATV into a toaster. But let me rewind. You need to know how we got to this perfect, explosive moment of karmic justice because it didn't start with sparks, it started with a subtle blip on my home energy monitor. See, I'm not just some guy with a multimeter and a grudge. I'm a certified systems engineer who designs power infrastructure for data centers. Electricity is my love language. So when my solar inverter started logging phantom drains during off-peak hours, I noticed. Most folks wouldn't, but I'm not most folks. I live in a quiet neighborhood where people brag about their lawn edges and homemade compost, and I keep to myself, tinkering with my home grid and watching for anomalies. That week, I'd noticed something weird. Every night between 1 o'clock and 3 a.m., there was a 1.8 kilowatt-hours dip that didn't match any of my devices. It wasn't HVAC, it wasn't the hot tub, it wasn't my backup battery cycling, it was something external. That was when I started suspecting the leech next door, Karen. You know the type, impossibly expensive sunglasses, a voice that carries like a foghorn, and zero understanding of personal boundaries. She had moved in 2 years ago after a messy divorce, and ever since, it had been a parade of poor decisions, wine-drunk brunches and HOA violations that mysteriously never got enforced. Her favorite pastime was making up new neighborhood rules and citing the HOA like it was the Constitution. She once yelled at a 10-year-old for riding his bike too close to her hydrangeas. But lately, her obsession was this souped-up electric ATV she got for her teenage son. It was loud, obnoxious, and worst of all, it ran on electricity. I first noticed the cord while I was trimming hedges, an orange extension cable slinking like a snake over the back fence. It looked like it came from her side and disappeared behind my tool shed. I blinked. That's impossible, I thought. I didn't have any outdoor outlets back there, unless, no way she'd be that bold. That night, I turned off all my exterior breakers except one, just to see. The next morning, there it was, a dip in the logs at exactly 2:12 a.m. I walked out, followed the fence line, and sure enough, the cord was gone, retracted, hidden, but not before I got pictures. I decided to confront her gently. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe her son plugged it in without realizing it was mine. I walked over the next day and rang her bell. She answered wearing yoga pants, sunglasses, and holding a mimosa like she was the queen of brunch. I mentioned the power drain and asked if, by any chance, someone in her household had used my outlet. She blinked, smiled, and said, "Oh, that? Yeah, we figured it was no biggie, just a little charge while we waited for our garage panel to get fixed. You've got solar, right? You barely notice it." Barely notice it? That's not how electricity works, and also not how permission works. I tried to explain that it was theft, however small, and that it affected my system balancing. Her response? She literally patted my arm and said, "Relax, you're such a tech guy. It's not like we're draining your car battery or something." I left before I said something I'd regret, but my mind was already working. I called the HOA and reported the theft. They said they'd look into it. 3 days later, I got a warning letter for creating hostile neighbor dynamics and unauthorized modifications to shared structures. Apparently, Karen claimed I had installed dangerous traps along the fence and was threatening her family with electric shock. I was stunned, but I wasn't going to play defense anymore. I'm not a confrontational guy, but if you plug yourself into my grid without asking and lie about it, oh, now you've entered my domain. Karen didn't know what she triggered. She thought I was just a quiet guy with solar panels. She didn't know I designed failsafe systems that power military-grade servers. She didn't know I'd once built a self-contained backup grid for a hospital using nothing but spare parts and caffeine. And she definitely didn't know I was about to turn her little midnight joyride into a very expensive fireworks show. I began sketching out the plan that night. I designed a decoy outlet, something she couldn't resist, wired to a perfectly legal, perfectly safe, but utterly devastating surprise. Something that would leave her charger in ruins without endangering a soul. It had to be subtle, invisible, and personal, because she hadn't just stolen power, she'd insulted my craft. I installed the fake outlet on my side of the fence, angled just enough to look forgotten, like I'd lazily left it wired to a tool shed junction. I made sure it looked tempting, unguarded, live, easy. But it wasn't. The outlet was connected to a carefully tuned impedance circuit that would fry any charger drawing more than 3 amps. No house appliance would trip it, but an ATV charger. Oh, absolutely. I set the trap. I watched. I waited. 3 nights later, the cord was back, coiled, plugged in. I watched from my workshop, sipping tea. At 2:17 a.m., the log spiked just as I'd planned. The circuit did its job. There was a bright blue flash, a loud pop, and then the crown jewel, Karen's shriek, piercing the night like a karaoke machine caught in a blender. I watched her son run out in his boxers, trying to figure out why his precious ATV was now billowing smoke like a Halloween prop. I'd never smiled so hard. That was just the beginning. Karen thought she could steal from an engineer and walk away, but the voltage she fried was nothing compared to what I was about to unleash. Because when the HOA got involved again, they made one fatal mistake, they backed her. And that meant war. The morning after the great power surge of Karen's backyard was one for the books. I woke up to the sound of her stomping around in slippers, muttering loudly about sabotage and calling the fire marshal. I stood at my kitchen window, sipping fresh coffee like I was watching live theater. The cord had vanished again, the ATV was tarped over like a crime scene, and Karen had her phone glued to her ear, presumably unleashing a dramatic retelling of how her child was nearly electrocuted by a booby-trapped outlet. Except there was no electrocution, just a fried charging unit and a mother who didn't understand that karma sometimes comes with fuses. But I wasn't celebrating yet. That had only been the first act. She hadn't learned her lesson. In fact, by midday, I received a visitor, a man in khakis and a golf shirt, clipboard in hand, wearing the smug expression of someone who thought they were about to lay down the law. You can't just install unauthorized electrical devices along a shared boundary, he said, not even introducing himself. Apparently, Karen had complained to the HOA again, and now they were here to scold me for hazardous installations that endanger the community. I tried to keep a straight face while he quoted bylaws to me, most of which had nothing to do with electricity and everything to do with Karen's creative interpretation of the HOA handbook. I explained that the outlet in question was on my property, legally installed, and wired to code. What he didn't know, and what I chose not to mention just yet, was that it had been rigged with a non-lethal surge induction loop that tripped when a specific current threshold was breached, entirely safe for humans, pets, or the occasional confused squirrel, but absolutely catastrophic for sensitive electronics. He made a note on his clipboard and muttered something about further review. I nodded politely and offered him a cookie. He declined. I knew then that this wasn't over. If anything, Karen was going to double down. That's what entitled people do, they escalate. And so, I had to escalate too, not in pettiness, but in precision. She wanted to play games. Fine. I'd play too. But I wasn't going to wait for another cord to snake its way across my fence. I needed to know the moment it happened. So I went back to the drawing board and did what I do best, I built a smarter trap. First, I upgraded the fake outlet. The original circuit had done its job, but I wanted real-time feedback now, so I added a hidden data logger connected to my home server. disguised inside an old garden gnome. Anytime something was plugged in, it would timestamp the event, capture the voltage draw, and send a notification to my phone. If it crossed a preset threshold, the outlet would deliver a carefully timed voltage spike, not enough to start a fire, but enough to make any charging circuit go poof. And yes, I tested it thoroughly on an old leaf blower. Twice. Next, I installed a set of motion-triggered cameras camouflaged as birdhouses and floodlights. They'd been lying in my garage from a past security upgrade I never finished. Now, they had purpose. One camera faced the fake outlet, another faced the back corner of Karen's yard where the ATV usually sat, and a third watched the common fence line. All feeds were routed to my server and backed up to the cloud. If Karen even sneezed near that outlet, I'd have footage. But the real genius was the decoy extension cord. I left it draped over my own fence, coiled just so, as if I'd gotten lazy cleaning up after yard work. It was plugged into the dummy outlet and looked functional, but the wiring had been rerouted through a surge trip circuit buried beneath my flower bed. If Karen or her spawn decided to yank the cord and use it again, they'd be in for another lovely surprise. 3 nights passed with no activity. I almost thought she'd learned. But on the 4th night, at exactly 1:42 a.m., my phone buzzed, power draw detected, 2.7 kilowatt-hours and rising. Then another alert, asterisk surge threshold exceeded. Event triggered, asterisk. I opened the live feed and watched in real time as a flash lit up the birdhouse camera. The extension cord twitched. The charger sparked. And the ATV gave a soft wheeze, as if it were sighing its last breath. Karen's son, shirtless and confused, jumped back with the grace of a stunned deer. He scrambled to unplug the cord, but it was too late. Smoke rose from the charger again, not as dramatic as the first time, but just enough to make the point. I sat back and smiled. System worked. Flawlessly. By morning, the cord was gone again, but the damage had been done, twice now, and I had video, timestamped, geotagged, and logged. This time, I didn't wait for the HOA to slap me with another nonsense fine. I printed off a stack of screenshots and walked them right into their office. The woman behind the desk, Janice, I think, flipped through them with wide eyes and a slowly growing scowl. "You're telling me she plugged into your outlet without permission?" she asked. "Twice," I said. "I've got full logs and footage. Also, check the bylaws, Section 8B, unauthorized utility access." Janice pursed her lips. She knew the rule, but Karen was tight with at least 2 board members, and this wasn't going to be cut and dry. "We'll need to conduct a review," she said. "In the meantime, I recommend removing any outdoor outlets to avoid escalation." "Janice," I said, leaning in slightly, "this is an HOA that fines people for mailbox color but lets Karen run an illegal power hookup across property lines. I've been patient. I've been quiet. But I don't think you understand what kind of system I'm sitting on. If I wanted, I could cut my entire home from the grid and run off battery for 6 months. I don't need your outlet policy, I need you to enforce the rules. Or I'll take this footage to the city utility board and file a complaint for theft." She blinked, her mouth opening, then closing. "Your move," I said, and walked out. That evening, Karen came stomping to my front porch, no mimosa, no sunglasses, just fury. She demanded to know what I'd done to her ATV. I told her I had no idea what she was talking about. She screamed that her son was traumatized. I said, maybe he should stop stealing electricity. She threatened to sue. I said, I have footage, logs, and an engineering degree that says otherwise. Then I handed her a USB stick. "What's this?" she asked. "Everything you need to realize you picked the wrong neighbor," I said, and gently closed the door in her face. She didn't knock again. But I knew this wasn't finished. Not yet. Entitled people like Karen don't give up after a single defeat. She would retaliate, she always did. And when she did, I'd be ready with more than just a surge circuit. I'd be ready with the truth, the law, and a neighborhood full of witnesses. Because it turns out, I wasn't the only one Karen had been stealing from. And once they found out, the real voltage storm would begin. 3 days after I handed Karen that USB stick, the fireworks began, not literal ones this time, those had already played out with her smoking ATV charger, but the social, explosive kind. Karen didn't take the hint. If anything, she must have thought I was bluffing. Instead of backing down, she decided to double down in a way only a true suburban tyrant could. That morning, a police cruiser pulled into my driveway. The officer was polite but firm. Apparently, Karen had filed a report claiming I had knowingly installed a dangerous electrical device that endangered her family. I asked if she'd also mentioned that her family had plugged into my outlet, without permission, on my private property, and that I had security footage proving it. The officer blinked. She didn't mention that. No, he said, almost sheepishly. So I invited him in. I brought him to my office, pulled up the footage, and walked him through every frame, Karen's son plugging in the cord, the time-stamped logs showing power siphoning, the second time they did it after the first charger had fried. I even showed the outlet schematics, clearly labeled, wired to code, and rigged to trip under high current load, completely safe to humans, dangerous only to thieves. The officer leaned back in his chair and scratched his head. "Wow," he said. "You're not playing around." "No, officer," I said. "I'm not. But they are. And they're dragging the law into their tantrum." He closed his notepad. "Look, from what I'm seeing here, she's got no case. This looks like theft of utilities, plain and simple. I'll write up my report. If she pushes further, you've got every piece of evidence to protect yourself. But I'll be honest, this kind of stuff usually dies when it hits the paperwork wall." I thanked him. And as he pulled out, I noticed Karen standing across the street, arms crossed, sunglasses on, sipping from what I assumed was her 5th iced latte of the day. She watched the cruiser leave, then looked straight at my house like she was daring me to come outside. But I didn't give her that satisfaction. I had bigger plans. Of course, the HOA wasn't done. The next day, I received an official letter in the mail, complete with a gold-embossed seal, like they were a royal court instead of a group of petty retirees with too much time. It claimed I was in violation of Section 12A, unauthorized electrical installations that pose a potential hazard to community safety. Attached was a fine for $500 and a mandatory inspection notice. Now I was angry. I filed my own complaint in return, backed with photos, logs, videos, and a full technical breakdown. I also CC'd the city's building inspector and the local energy utility board. Because if the HOA wanted to pretend to be serious, I'd bring the real grown-ups into the room. But something unexpected happened next. A few neighbors started approaching me. First was Tom, the guy with the tricked-out outdoor kitchen 2 houses down. Then Nancy, who always waved but never said much. Then the Patel family, who ran a small catering business from home. One by one, they started asking weirdly specific questions. "Hey, you ever notice your fridge blinking like it lost power overnight? Do your motion lights ever reset by themselves? Did Karen ever ask if she could use your outdoor outlets?" That last one hit a nerve. I asked them if they'd had similar power drops. Tom nodded. He said his outdoor mini-fridge had started losing chill overnight. Nancy mentioned that her garden lights would flicker around 2 a.m. and then reset. The Patels said they'd had a whole freezer thaw out a few weeks ago because of a mysterious breaker trip. That was when it hit me. Karen hadn't just been stealing from me. She had been running a literal network of theft across the entire block. I invited them over for coffee and showed them my setup, explained how I tracked the power usage and how I'd set traps to catch her in the act. When I played the footage of her son sneaking into my yard and plugging in the charger, they gasped. Tom burst out laughing. I knew she was shady, but this is Olympic-level theft. We formed a group chat later that day. We called it Shocked by Karen. Within hours, it had 10 members. By nightfall, it had 23. Turns out, Karen had been getting free juice from half the neighborhood for months. She had her son plugging into unlocked outlets, outdoor garden ports, even one guy's RV hookup while he was on vacation. No one had proof, until now. So we organized. Each neighbor checked their outdoor outlets and installed temporary lockboxes or covers. I helped Tom rig up a smart monitor. Nancy gave me the go-ahead to install a decoy cord at her place too. It wasn't just revenge anymore, it was neighborhood justice. We weren't just fed up with the theft, we were tired of the smugness, the manipulation, the way Karen thought she could walk through life like the rules bent around her. And then came the HOA meeting. Held monthly in the clubhouse, it was usually a snore-fest filled with debates about flower bed heights and acceptable patio colors. But not this time. We showed up in numbers, USB sticks, screenshots, time logs. One by one, we took the floor and laid it all out. Karen sat in the front row, arms crossed, jaw clenched, looking like a cat dropped in a dog park. She tried to speak. She tried to deflect. These people are exaggerating. This is all hearsay. They're just jealous. But the HOA president, Greg, one of her longtime allies, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Because even he couldn't ignore the numbers. Or the footage. Or the police report, which I handed him in a nice manila folder. And then, the bombshell. One neighbor had gone the extra mile and pulled their power bill from the past year. Their monthly average had spiked inexplicably around the same time Karen had gotten her ATV. Another neighbor matched dates from their breaker logs. Everything lined up. We built a case. A rock-solid, data-backed, idiot-proof case. Karen stood up and screamed that we were harassing her, that she was being targeted, that she had every right to access community power since her HOA dues were so high. She actually said that. Community power. As if our personal property had become public domain. That was her final mistake. The room erupted in protest. Even Greg couldn't protect her now. The board voted to suspend her HOA privileges pending a full investigation. Fines were discussed. A restraining order was mentioned. Karen stormed out, nearly knocking over the punch table. But it wasn't over yet. Because one more revelation was coming, something I hadn't even planned. Karen had been using the stolen electricity not just for charging her ATV. She'd been hosting backyard parties, full lighting rigs, mini fridges, even a karaoke machine, all plugged in discreetly to neighbor power. Her backyard had been a parasite-powered nightclub. And I had the footage. The storm wasn't over. In fact, the worst was yet to come. Following the heated community meeting and the subsequent suspension of Karen's HOA privileges, what had initially appeared to be a neighborhood nuisance rapidly evolved into a comprehensive case of coordinated utility theft with broader implications. The situation demanded a more detailed and technical approach, one that involved careful audits of historical energy usage, metadata correlations, and forensic review of footage spanning several months. Given the extensive complaints emerging from multiple residents, it became evident that the scope of Karen's behavior wasn't isolated to sporadic power siphoning. Instead, it demonstrated clear patterns of repeated, calculated abuse of infrastructure not belonging to her. The starting point for deeper analysis lay in the data harvested from the decoy systems I and others had recently implemented. With explicit consent, I integrated additional smart monitoring devices across several affected properties. The collective data, when time-synchronized and overlaid across the neighborhood power map, revealed definitive surge patterns consistent with external charging equipment being attached and removed under cover of night. The timestamps aligned almost perfectly with footage showing Karen's teenage son moving between properties, often masked under pretexts like retrieving balls or performing yard tasks. Furthermore, My analysis of power phase fluctuations identified transient voltage drops in the neighborhood's shared subgrid. These dips weren't consistent with standard residential draw but indicated high-amperage induction devices, most likely inverter-based systems like those used for electric vehicles or industrial appliances. This constituted misuse of residential power systems for equipment they were never intended to sustain, representing both civil infraction and potentially criminal misuse of public utility access. As this analysis compiled, I received communication from a city energy auditor reviewing my technical documentation. They confirmed the report's merit, noting that what began as private neighbor-to-neighbor theft now warranted classification as third-party utility fraud under Municipal Code 4.3.7. Unauthorized, unmetered use exceeding specific thresholds could result in criminal charges and restitution demands, particularly relevant as Karen's misuse spanned multiple residences with aggregate impact calculated at over 3,000 kilowatt-hours across 4 months. Social testimony from neighbors added compelling circumstantial evidence. Tom's smart sprinkler system had been inexplicably cycling off, logs showed brownouts coinciding with Karen's parties. The Patel's commercial-grade freezer had thawed during critical catering prep. Elderly Mrs. Wilkins' medical equipment had logged dangerous power fluctuations. Most damning was my reconstruction of Karen's party circuit, using drone footage and luminance analysis from security cameras. The combined load of her string lights, bass amplifiers, refrigerated drink coolers, and portable karaoke system demanded minimum 2.2 kilowatts per hour, all drawn through unauthorized connections routed across fences, beneath hedges, and in one case into a rewired irrigation control box. Working with affected neighbors, we submitted formal complaints to both the City Utility Board and local law enforcement. A private attorney began drafting civil claims for damages. Our strategy was multi-pronged. Pursue financial restitution. Support potential criminal charges. Force HOA bylaw amendments regarding utility theft. Karen, meanwhile, oscillated between denial and victimhood. She claimed we were conducting surveillance mob rule and neighborhood fascism, once dramatically declaring this outside the clubhouse. Her rhetoric failed against the mounting evidence. The HOA, sensing eroded credibility, convened an emergency meeting. For once, leadership abandoned passive deflection. Karen was removed from all committees. Stripped of communal amenities access. Ordered to remove all unauthorized electrical crossings. The coup de grace came via certified letter from the Energy Authority, an investigation notice for meter tampering and utility theft under City Code 4.3.7. When Karen failed to comply with their inspection request, they issued a subpoena. As word spread, neighborhood sentiment shifted from frustration to vindication. Even previously neutral residents spoke out against Karen's entitlement. The utility company's final analysis showed a $1,800 back bill, compounded by HOA fines and legal fees. The documentation alone spanned 60 pages with full resolution screenshots, legal definitions, comparative energy profiles, community impact summation. At no point did Karen apologize or take responsibility. Even confronted with irrefutable evidence, she defaulted to denial. Which only confirmed she'd underestimated neighbors' capacity to respond with precision documentation rather than emotional reactivity. In the weeks following Karen's downfall, the neighborhood underwent unexpected transformation. The Shocked by Karen group chat evolved into a community forum sharing gardening tips and event plans. New HOA elections ousted complacent board members, replacing them with reformists like Gwen, a former firefighter who drafted clear anti-theft policies. I was asked to join the infrastructure committee but declined, preferring advisory roles. Karen's property became eerily quiet. The ATV was sold, the karaoke machine vanished, replaced by a sudden proliferation of garden gnomes, a transparent attempt at image rehabilitation. Her son, once the cul-de-sac prince, became a sullen lawn laborer avoiding eye contact. The final confrontation came weeks later as I adjusted my solar panels. Karen approached, no sunglasses, no posturing, and mumbled something resembling an apology. I messed up. Didn't realize how serious it was. I replied evenly, it's never harmless when you take what isn't yours. Especially not repeatedly. She nodded awkwardly and retreated. Whether genuine or calculated, it changed nothing. The consequences were already in motion. That evening, I sat on my porch watching sunset paint the rooftops orange. No ATV buzz. No phantom power drains. Just wind through trees and kids riding regular bicycles. Neighbors waved with genuine smiles. Peace, I realized, isn't something you wait for. You design it carefully. Protect it fiercely. And if someone tries to steal it, you give them a shock they'll never forget.